She kept telling everyone she was only trying to protect our home, said it with so much pride that, for a while, I almost believed her. But there was something in the way she avoided my eyes whenever the topic came up, a tension I couldn't explain. Then the bank asked to speak with me about a recent request, and in that moment, I realized the truth about who was really protecting what, and it was nothing like I expected. Hi there, I'm Kendall Ray, and I need to tell you something that's been eating at me for months now. You know that feeling when someone you trust completely blindsides you? Well, that happened with my mother-in-law, Patricia. She moved in 3 years ago after her husband died, and I thought I knew exactly who she was. Turns out, I didn't know her at all. Maybe talking through this will help me make sense of what really went down. Patricia settled into our guest room like she'd always belonged there. Within weeks, she was reorganizing our kitchen cabinets and asking about our mortgage terms over breakfast. Just want to understand how you kids are managing, she'd say, buttering her toast. David didn't question it. His mom had always been involved in family finances, but something felt different this time, more urgent, more calculating than motherly concern. She started mentioning our house value in casual conversation. At the grocery store, she'd tell the cashier, "My kids have such a beautiful home, worth about $300,000 now." At David's cousin's wedding, she brought up our equity to strangers. I'd catch her scrolling through Zillow on her phone, looking up comparable sales in our neighborhood. When I asked why, she'd shrug. Just curious about the market. The mail became her territory. Every afternoon, Patricia would sort through everything before we got home from work. "I organized your bills," she'd announce, stacking everything neatly on the counter. Our mortgage statements always seemed to be on top, corners perfectly aligned. When I mentioned we could handle our own mail, her face tightened. "I'm just trying to help," she said, but her voice carried an edge I'd never heard before. David brushed off my concerns. "That's just mom being mom," he'd say when I mentioned her increasing interest in our finances. He'd grown up with Patricia managing every detail of their family's money. What looked intrusive to me felt normal to him. I started second-guessing myself. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe this was what having a helpful mother-in-law looked like, and I just wasn't used to it. Last spring, we refinanced to get a better interest rate. Patricia's questions became specific, technical. "What's your new monthly payment? How much did you take out in cash? What's the loan-to-value ratio?" She'd ask these questions during dinner, pen and notepad beside her plate. When David answered, she'd write everything down. For my own records, she'd explain when she caught me staring. One Tuesday evening, I found her in David's home office. She was sitting at his desk with a calculator, surrounded by our bank statements and tax returns. The moment she saw me, she started shuffling papers together. "David asked me to help with your taxes," she said quickly. But tax season was months away, and David had never mentioned needing help. Her hands were shaking slightly as she gathered everything up. Phone calls began happening behind closed doors. Patricia would disappear into her room for 20-minute conversations, speaking in voices too low for me to hear. When I asked who she'd been talking to, she always had an answer ready. My book club friend Mary or that neighbor from my old place. But the answers came too fast, too polished. And why would book club discussions require such privacy? She began collecting newspaper clippings about foreclosures and financial disasters. I found them tucked between cookbooks, stories about families losing homes, retirement savings wiped out, medical bankruptcies. When I asked about them, Patricia said she was staying informed about the economy. But these weren't recent articles. Some were years old, yellowed and carefully preserved. She'd been collecting evidence of other people's financial ruin for longer than I'd realized. The conversations about home equity loans started subtly. Patricia would mention friends who'd leveraged their property for various reasons. A neighbor who'd paid for her daughter's wedding. A woman from church who'd consolidated debt. "Smart people use their equity," she'd say, watching our faces carefully. "Money sitting in a house isn't helping anyone." These comments felt like she was testing our reactions to something. Her behavior around our financial documents became obsessive. I'd find folders rearranged, papers organized by date rather than type. Our mortgage file had obviously been studied, pages had finger smudges, and documents were creased from handling. When I reorganized everything back to our system, Patricia would find reasons to go through it again. "Just making sure nothing important gets lost," she'd say. Morning of October 15th, the phone rang while I was getting ready for work. I answered without checking caller ID. "Mrs. Henderson? This is Janet from First National Bank." I need to speak with you about a recent request regarding your property. My stomach dropped. We hadn't made any requests to any bank about anything. The confusion in my voice must have been obvious because Janet paused. According to our records, someone initiated a home equity loan application using your property as collateral. The application shows you and your husband as co-applicants, requesting $90,000. The words hit me like cold water. I sat down hard on our kitchen stool, gripping the phone. Someone had applied for a loan in our names, using our house, and only one person had access to all our information. I told Janet I'd call her back and hung up with shaking hands. The kitchen felt surreal, sunlight streaming through windows, coffee still brewing, everything normal except for this bomb that had just exploded in my lap. Patricia was upstairs getting dressed for her morning walk. In 30 minutes, she'd come down for breakfast and ask about my day like nothing had happened. Like she hadn't just tried to steal $90,000 from us. I called David at work. "Come home now," I said. "It's about your mother, and you need to be here." When he started asking questions, I cut him off. "Just come home, David. The bank called." Those 4 words were enough. His voice changed immediately, became careful and scared. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said. I spent those 20 minutes sitting at our kitchen table, staring at my hands. David walked through the door looking pale and worried. I showed him my notes from the phone call, watched his face change as he read Janet's words. "Mom wouldn't do this," he kept saying, but his voice got weaker each time. He was trying to convince himself more than me. When I mentioned all the strange behavior we'd been ignoring, his shoulders sagged. The pieces were fitting together, and the picture wasn't pretty. We called Patricia downstairs. She appeared in her walking clothes, sneakers, light jacket, ready for her daily routine around the neighborhood. When she saw us both sitting at the table with serious expressions, her confident smile disappeared. "What's wrong?" she asked, but she was already moving toward the chair across from us like someone preparing for bad news. "The bank called about a loan application," David said gently. "A home equity loan for $90,000, using our house as collateral." Patricia's face went completely white. She opened her mouth, then closed it. For maybe 30 seconds, nobody spoke. Then she started crying, not dramatic sobs, just quiet tears running down her cheeks. "I can explain," she whispered. Her explanation was worse than malicious intent. She'd convinced herself we were financially vulnerable, that disaster was coming, that we needed protection. We were too naive to arrange ourselves. What if David lost his job? What if one of you got sick? She'd researched our expenses, calculated our savings, and decided we were living too close to the edge. The $90,000 was supposed to be our safety net, managed by her. We spent the rest of that morning at the kitchen table, unraveling months of deception and misguided protection. Patricia had forged our signatures, lied to bank representatives, and planned to present us with the money as a gift. In her mind, she was the hero of this story. Looking at her tear-stained face, I realized she genuinely believed she'd been saving us from financial ruin that existed only in her imagination. The drive to the bank felt surreal. Patricia sat in the back seat, apologizing continuously, explaining how she'd only wanted to help. David drove in silence, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. I stared out the window at our neighborhood, the same streets we'd driven down thousands of times, except everything felt different now. Trust, once broken, changes the landscape of your entire life. Even familiar places look strange when you're seeing them through new eyes. 20 minutes later, we sat across from Janet at her desk while she explained the seriousness of loan fraud. Patricia's face crumpled when she heard the word fraud. "I never thought of it that way," she said. "I just wanted them to be safe. But intentions don't change legal realities." We withdrew the application and cleared our names, but the damage to our family was just beginning. Some bells can't be unrung, some trust can't be easily repaired. Driving home, I found myself wondering how long Patricia had been planning this. The newspaper clippings, the financial research, the forged signatures, none of this happened overnight. She'd been living in our house for months, maybe years, believing we were headed for disaster and that she was our only hope. The depth of her deception was matched only by the sincerity of her concern. Somehow, that made everything worse rather than better. That afternoon, sitting in our living room with Patricia across from us, everything felt different. The same furniture, the same family photos, but the air between us had changed completely. Patricia kept saying she'd never meant to hurt us, that she'd only wanted to protect our future. Looking at her now, I could see the fear that had been driving her all along. But understanding her motivation didn't make the betrayal any easier to swallow. 3 weeks later, Patricia signed the lease on a one-bedroom apartment 10 minutes from our house. The morning she handed me her spare key, I noticed her hands weren't shaking anymore. "For emergencies," she said, pressing the metal into my palm. "Though I suppose I'm the emergency you need protection from now." Her laugh was bitter, but there was something like relief underneath it. Maybe having her own space again felt like freedom rather than exile. The apartment came furnished, which seemed fitting. Patricia didn't want reminders of the life she'd built in our guest room, the carefully arranged photos, the reading corner she'd created by the window. "Fresh start," she told David when he offered to move her things. She took only clothes, a few books, and the coffee maker we'd bought her last Christmas. Everything else stayed behind like evidence of a crime. Margaret drove up from Portland to help with the move. The two sisters worked efficiently, folding clothes and packing boxes without much conversation. I watched them through the window, these women who'd known each other for 70 years, and wondered what stories they were sharing about our family crisis. Margaret kept glancing toward our house like she was trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. David couldn't bring himself to help pack. He spent the moving day at work, came home after Patricia was gone. The empty guest room felt enormous suddenly, like we'd removed more than just furniture. He stood in the doorway for a long time, hands in his pockets. "Feels different," he said finally. I wanted to comfort him, but I was still too angry to offer sympathy about losing the mother who'd tried to defraud us. Dr. Reynolds had warned us that family healing isn't a straight line. The first few weeks proved her right. Patricia called every day with small emergencies, a leaky faucet, confusion about her electric bill, weird sounds at night. Each crisis required David's immediate attention, and I watched him respond like a trained animal to the sound of her distress. Some patterns are harder to break than others. I started visiting Thursday afternoons, partly from guilt and partly from curiosity. Who was Patricia when she wasn't performing the role of helpful mother-in-law? Her apartment smelled like vanilla candles and instant coffee. She'd arranged her few possessions carefully, creating the illusion of a life that had always existed in this small space. "Tea?" she'd ask, playing hostess in her new territory. During these visits, Patricia began talking about things she'd never mentioned before. Her marriage hadn't been as happy as she'd pretended. Robert had controlled their finances completely, never let her see bank statements or credit card bills. "When he died, I didn't even know how much money we had," she admitted. "Everything was a mystery, and I swore I'd never be that helpless again." The loan application started making different kind of sense. She told me about panic attacks that started after Robert's funeral. 3 in the morning, wide awake, convinced that disaster was coming for everyone she loved. "I'd lie there making mental lists of everything that could go wrong," she said. "Job loss, medical bills, market crashes." By dawn, I'd convinced myself you and David were one emergency away from losing everything. Fear, not greed, had driven her to forge our signatures. The counseling sessions shifted focus from crisis management to communication. Patricia practiced asking for help directly instead of solving problems that existed only in her mind. David worked on supporting his mother without sacrificing his marriage. I learned to voice concerns before they turned into suspicions. These felt like basic life skills, but apparently our family had never developed them properly. Patricia found work at the local library, helping seniors with financial literacy classes. "Turns out my money obsession is useful when applied to the right situation," she told me after her first week. Watching her teach budgeting basics to other widows, I saw glimpses of who she might have been if fear hadn't consumed her. She was patient, knowledgeable, genuinely helpful when her anxiety wasn't running the show. The Thursday visits became less obligatory and more genuine. Patricia cooked simple meals, nothing elaborate like the dinner performances she'd staged in our house. We talked about books, neighborhood gossip, her growing friendship with Mrs. Chin next door. These conversations felt more honest than most we'd had when she lived with us. Distance, it seemed, had made intimacy possible again. Margaret mentioned that Patricia was sleeping better, taking fewer anxiety medications. "She says having her own space makes her feel safer," Margaret told me during one visit. "Like she's not responsible for everyone else's problems anymore." This struck me as ironic, since Patricia's attempts to solve our non-existent problems had created the biggest problem of all. But maybe responsibility and control are different things entirely. David's daily phone calls to his mother became weekly visits. The conversations were careful, polite, focused on practical matters rather than emotions. He'd ask about her work, her health, her apartment maintenance issues. She'd inquire about our jobs, our plans, our home repairs. They were rebuilding their relationship from scratch, learning to care about each other without the assumption of unconditional trust. Patricia surprised us by asking if we wanted to sell the house. Not because of what I did, she said quickly. But maybe you need a fresh start somewhere without so many complicated memories. The offer was generous, considering everything, but David and I had already decided to stay. Running away felt like letting her financial fraud win, somehow. We were reclaiming our home rather than abandoning it. The bank paperwork was finally closed 6 weeks after Patricia moved out. Janet sent a letter confirming that all fraudulent documents had been destroyed and our credit remained unaffected. Reading that letter felt like the end of something, though I couldn't tell if it was the crisis or just the first chapter of recovery. Either way, the legal aspects were settled. The emotional work would take longer. Christmas was awkward but manageable. Patricia came for dinner, brought thoughtful gifts, helped with cleanup without taking over the kitchen. She left by 8 o'clock, before the evening became too comfortable, too much like the old days. "Thank you for including me," she said at the door, formal as a guest, which, I realized, was exactly what she was now. Family, but also a visitor in our lives. Patricia began dating Harold from her apartment complex. She mentioned him casually at first, a nice man who'd helped with her cable installation, someone who played cards in the community room. Then she started styling her hair differently, wearing lipstick to our visits. "He lost his wife 2 years ago," she explained when David asked direct questions. "We understand each other." This was the first time I'd seen Patricia happy rather than merely content. The relationship with Harold changed Patricia in ways I hadn't expected. She stopped calling with daily emergencies. Her conversations became less focused on problems and more about activities, movies they'd watched, restaurants they'd tried, plans for weekend drives. She was building a life that didn't revolve around managing other people's potential disasters. The woman who'd tried to control our finances was learning to enjoy the present moment. Dr. Reynolds suggested we could reduce our counseling sessions from weekly to monthly. "You've developed good communication patterns," she said during our last regular appointment. "Now it's about maintaining them." The crisis had forced us to learn skills that should have been second nature. We were becoming the family we'd always thought we were, just more intentionally and with clearer boundaries. Spring brought news that Patricia and Harold were discussing marriage. She'd asked Margaret's opinion, then David's blessing, before mentioning it to me. "I never thought I'd want to be married again," she said during one Thursday visit. "But Harold makes me feel like I have a future, not just a past to protect." This was the first time Patricia had talked about the future without fear clouding every possibility. Looking back on the worst year of our family's life, I'm surprised by what we gained rather than lost. Patricia found independence and purpose. David learned to love his mother without enabling her anxiety. I discovered that forgiveness is a choice you make repeatedly, not a destination you reach once. Our family had been broken and rebuilt, and the new version felt more honest than what we'd had before. Some disasters, it turns out, are actually disguised opportunities. That first dinner at Patricia's apartment lasted exactly 90 minutes. She'd spent the afternoon making David's favorite pot roast, and the smell filled her small living room like she was trying to recreate something we'd lost. But sitting around her tiny table felt like performing in a play none of us had rehearsed. Patricia kept jumping up to refill water glasses, check the rolls, adjust the lighting. Staying busy was easier than sitting with the silence. David complimented everything twice: the seasoning, the tender meat, even the store-bought dinner rolls. Patricia glowed under his attention, but there was desperation in how she kept asking if he needed more potatoes, if the gravy was too thin. She was working so hard to be the perfect hostess that none of us could relax. I found myself counting the minutes until we could politely leave. After dinner, Patricia gave us a tour of her one-bedroom apartment like we hadn't helped her move in the week before. She pointed out where she'd hung her favorite photo of David's father, how the afternoon light hit her reading chair just right. "It's quite cozy," she kept saying. The apartment was nice enough, but everything felt temporary, like a hotel room someone was trying to make homey. Driving home, David gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. "That was harder than I expected," he said when we reached our driveway. We sat in the car for 10 minutes, neither of us ready to go inside and face the empty guest room. The easy family dinners we'd taken for granted felt like a luxury we'd lost without appreciating. Everything required effort now. Dr. Reynolds had warned us about setbacks. The next week brought several. Patricia called Tuesday morning about a dripping faucet, Thursday about her cable bill, Saturday night about strange noises. Each crisis demanded David's immediate response, and I watched him drop everything to drive over. The physical distance hadn't changed the emotional patterns. She was still finding ways to need rescuing. I started visiting Thursday afternoons alone. Patricia would have coffee ready, cookies arranged on her good plate. Without David there, she talked differently, less performance, more honesty. She told me about her marriage, how Robert had controlled every financial decision. I didn't even know our credit card numbers, she said. When he died, I felt like a child trying to figure out grown-up responsibilities. During one visit, Patricia showed me a shoebox filled with newspaper clippings about foreclosures. Some were years old, yellowed and carefully cut out. She'd been collecting evidence of other people's disasters long before she moved in with us. I know it looks crazy, she said, but reading about families who lost everything made me feel like I was preparing for something. Like knowledge would protect us somehow. These revelations changed how I understood the loan application. Patricia wasn't trying to steal from us, she was trying to save us from disasters that existed mainly in her imagination. Fear, not greed, had driven her to forge our signatures. Understanding her motivation didn't excuse what she'd done, but it explained the genuine tears when we'd confronted her. She believed she was protecting us. The library job started 3 weeks after she moved out. Patricia was teaching basic budgeting to seniors, helping them understand bank statements and avoid scams. Turns out my obsession with financial disasters is useful when applied correctly, she told me after her first week. For the first time since Robert's death, she had a purpose that didn't involve managing other people's problems. Margaret visited in November, and the two sisters spent hours sorting through Patricia's old papers. She's keeping records of everything now, Margaret told me privately. Bank statements, rental agreements, medical bills. Like she's proving to herself that she's capable of handling her own finances. This methodical approach to independence felt healthier than the chaotic anxiety that had led to the loan fraud. Patricia's apartment gradually began looking like a home rather than a temporary shelter. She bought new curtains, arranged family photos, started keeping fresh flowers on her kitchen table. Mrs. Chen from next door became a regular visitor, teaching Patricia to play mahjong. These small changes suggested she was building a life rather than just existing in exile from ours. David's daily phone calls to his mother became weekly visits. The conversations were careful, focused on practical matters. He'd ask about her work, her health, her apartment complex activities. She'd inquire about our jobs and home projects. They were learning to care about each other without assuming unconditional access. Love with boundaries felt foreign to both of them, but they were practicing. Christmas planning required negotiation. Patricia wanted to host, but her apartment was too small for extended family. We wanted to include her without falling back into old patterns. We finally decided on Christmas morning at our house, with Patricia arriving at 10 and leaving by 4. Structured time together felt artificial, but it worked. She brought thoughtful gifts and helped with cleanup without taking over. Harold appeared in January. Patricia mentioned him casually at first, a neighbor who'd helped with her icy walkway, someone who played bridge in the community room. Then she started wearing lipstick to our visits, styling her hair differently. He's a widower too, she explained when David asked direct questions. We understand each other's situation. This was the first time I'd seen Patricia happy rather than just coping. The relationship with Harold transformed Patricia in ways I hadn't expected. Her phone calls became less frequent, her conversations more about activities than problems. She mentioned movies they'd watched, restaurants they'd tried, plans for spring garden walks. She was discovering that life could involve enjoyment rather than just crisis management. The woman who'd tried to control our financial future was learning to live in the present. Spring brought surprising news. Patricia had saved enough money from her library job to take a vacation, her first solo trip since Robert's death. She was visiting Margaret in Portland for a week, had booked her own flights and rental car. I want to prove to myself that I can be completely independent, she said. The confidence required for this trip seemed like evidence of real growth. While Patricia was in Portland, David and I found ourselves missing her Thursday visits. Not the anxious, desperate woman who'd lived in our guest room, but the calmer version who was building her own life 10 minutes away. She's becoming someone I actually enjoy spending time with, David said one evening. Instead of someone I feel obligated to take care of. This shift felt significant for both of them. Patricia returned from Portland with stories about Margaret's grandchildren, restaurants she'd tried alone, museums she'd explored at her own pace. I remembered that I'm good company for myself, she said during our next visit. For someone who'd spent months convinced that solitude meant vulnerability, this was a remarkable discovery. She was learning the difference between being alone and being lonely. Dr. Reynolds suggested reducing our sessions to monthly check-ins. You've developed healthy communication patterns, she said. Now it's about maintaining them. The crisis had forced us to learn relationship skills that should have been instinctive. We were becoming the family we'd always thought we were, just more intentionally and with clearer boundaries between love and obligation. Harold proposed in May, and Patricia said yes after calling David for his blessing. Their conversation was the most mature discussion I'd ever witnessed between them. They talked honestly about concerns and hopes without either trying to protect the other from difficult emotions. Patricia was planning her second marriage as an independent woman rather than someone seeking rescue from loneliness. Looking back on the year that had nearly destroyed our family, I was surprised by what we'd gained. Patricia found purpose and independence. David learned to love his mother without enabling her anxiety. I discovered that some disasters are actually opportunities in disguise. We'd been forced to rebuild our relationships on more honest foundations, and the new version felt stronger than what we'd had before. Patricia's transformation over the next year caught all of us off guard. The anxious woman who'd tried to secretly mortgage our house was replaced by someone who planned weekend trips with Harold, taught financial literacy at 3 different senior centers, and recently convinced Mrs. Chen to apply for a small business loan for her granddaughter. Last month, she called to tell me she'd been elected treasurer of her apartment complex's board. They trust me with money now, she said, laughing at the irony. Harold proposed on a Tuesday evening in March. Patricia called us immediately, breathless with excitement. He got down on one knee right there in the community garden, she said. Mrs. Chen was watering her tomatoes and started clapping. David and I looked at each other across our kitchen table, both thinking the same thing. When was the last time we'd heard Patricia sound genuinely happy? Not grateful or relieved, but actually joyful about something happening in her life. The engagement dinner was Harold's idea, held at that Italian restaurant downtown where they'd had their 3rd date. Harold's daughter flew in from Denver. His son drove up from Sacramento. They wanted to meet David and me officially, to blend their families before the wedding. I was nervous about playing the role of Patricia's daughter-in-law to strangers, but the evening surprised me. Harold's children were warm, funny people who clearly adored their father and approved of his choice. Patricia looked radiant that night, wearing a blue dress I'd never seen before and the pearl earrings Harold had given her for Christmas. She told stories about her library students, asked Harold's grandchildren about school, and laughed at his jokes without any of the forced cheerfulness that used to characterize family gatherings. Watching her across the table, I realized she'd become someone I genuinely enjoyed being around rather than someone I felt obligated to include. Wedding planning revealed a side of Patricia I'd never seen. She wanted something simple, a ceremony in the community garden, reception in the clubhouse, maybe 40 guests total. We're too old for elaborate productions, she told me while we looked at flowers. I want to celebrate what we have, not perform what people expect. This practical approach to romance felt refreshingly different from the anxious perfectionism that had once defined her approach to everything. David offered to help pay for the wedding, and Patricia's response surprised both of us. Thank you, but Harold and I can handle our own expenses, she said gently. We've both been managing our finances separately for 2 years. We don't need anyone else's help. The woman who'd once tried to control our money was now politely declining financial assistance. Her independence wasn't just geographic anymore, it was emotional and financial too. The Thursday afternoon visits had evolved into something more reciprocal. Instead of me checking on Patricia, we'd become actual friends who enjoyed each other's company. She'd tell me about her students' progress, I'd update her on work projects. Sometimes Harold would join us, and the 3 of us would play cards or work crossword puzzles. These gatherings felt natural rather than obligatory, chosen rather than assumed. Margaret's visit for the engagement party gave me new perspective on Patricia's transformation. The 2 sisters sat in Patricia's living room, looking through old photos and sharing memories I'd never heard before. She's herself again, Margaret told me privately. Actually, she's better than herself. She's the person she might have become if fear hadn't taken over for all those years. This observation felt accurate. Patricia seemed more confident now than in any previous version I'd known. The library work had expanded into paid consulting. Patricia was helping 3 different nonprofits develop financial education programs for seniors and low-income families. Turns out my experience with money anxiety is valuable when applied to helping others, she said during one visit. Last week, she'd been invited to speak at a conference about financial fraud prevention. The woman who'd committed loan fraud was becoming an expert on avoiding it. Harold's influence on Patricia was subtle but significant. He encouraged her to try new things, art classes at the community center, weekend trips to coastal towns, even a cooking class where they learned to make Thai food together. Patricia had spent years focused on preventing disasters. Now she was actively seeking new experiences. The shift from fear-based to curiosity-based living seemed to energize her in ways I hadn't expected. David's relationship with his mother had found a comfortable rhythm. He called her twice a week, visited for Sunday dinner once a month, and included her in major decisions without feeling responsible for her happiness. Last month, when our water heater died, he mentioned the repair costs during their regular phone call. "That's expensive," Patricia said sympathetically, "but I'm sure you've budgeted for home maintenance." No offers to help, no anxiety about our financial management, just normal family conversation. The counseling sessions had become monthly maintenance appointments rather than crisis intervention. Dr. Reynolds often commented on how much our communication had improved. "You've learned to discuss problems when they're small rather than waiting until they become emergencies," she said during our last session. Patricia nodded, adding, "I'm practicing asking for what I need instead of trying to solve what I think other people need." This self-awareness felt hard-won but genuine. Spring brought news that Patricia and Harold were house hunting together. Not an apartment this time, but a small house with a proper kitchen and guest room for visiting children and grandchildren. "We want space to host people," Patricia explained, "but we're looking at places we can easily afford on our own incomes." The financial planning was careful but optimistic. They were building toward a shared future without anxiety about disaster scenarios. The house they chose was a 2-bedroom ranch style about 15 minutes from us, with a large backyard that Harold wanted for vegetable gardens. Patricia was excited about having her own kitchen again, space for holiday dinners and family gatherings. "I miss cooking for people I love," she told me while we toured the empty rooms. "But this time I'll be cooking because I want to, not because I'm trying to prove my worth." Moving day was scheduled for June, 2 weeks before their July wedding. David and I volunteered to help, along with Margaret and Harold's son. The day felt celebratory rather than stressful. Patricia directed operations with calm efficiency while Harold supplied cold beer and terrible jokes. Watching them work together to arrange furniture and hang pictures, I saw glimpses of the partnership they were building. Equal, supportive, but not dependent. Patricia's influence on our own marriage had been unexpected. Working through her betrayal together had forced David and me to discuss fears and expectations we'd previously left unexamined. We talked more honestly about money, family obligations, and future planning. The crisis had pushed us to develop communication skills that strengthened our relationship. Some disasters, it turned out, carried hidden gifts if you were willing to receive them. The wedding was exactly what Patricia and Harold had envisioned: simple, elegant, focused on celebration rather than ceremony. Patricia wore a cream-colored dress and carried flowers from Harold's garden. David walked her down the short aisle between folding chairs, and I watched him place her hand in Harold's with genuine warmth. The woman getting married that day bore little resemblance to the frightened person who'd tried to mortgage our house 3 years before. The reception was held in the community clubhouse, decorated with lights Harold had strung that morning. Patricia's library students attended, along with neighbors, Margaret's family, and Harold's children and grandchildren. The most touching moment came when Mrs. Chin gave a toast about how Patricia had helped her understand Medicare benefits, preventing a costly mistake. Patricia was surrounded by people whose lives she'd improved rather than controlled. The difference felt significant. Harold's toast to Patricia brought tears to my eyes. He thanked her for teaching him that it's possible to build love after loss, that vulnerability can be a form of strength rather than weakness. "Patricia showed me that asking for help is different from trying to control outcomes," he said. "She's learned to trust the future instead of trying to prevent it." The man understood his bride in ways that honored both her growth and her remaining struggles. The honeymoon was a 2-week trip to New England, planned and paid for jointly by the new couple. Patricia sent postcards from Vermont, Massachusetts, and Maine, not anxious check-ins, but genuine vacation updates about museums visited, restaurants tried, and scenic drives enjoyed. For someone who'd once been too frightened to make independent decisions, Traveling with a new husband to unfamiliar places represented enormous personal growth and confidence. Returning from their honeymoon, Patricia and Harold settled into married life with the kind of contentment that comes from choosing partnership rather than needing rescue. They hosted their first dinner party in August, inviting David and me along with Margaret and several neighbors. Patricia moved through her own kitchen with quiet confidence, Harold assisted without taking over, and their guests enjoyed the kind of relaxed hospitality that can't be performed. They'd created something genuine together, built on mutual respect rather than desperate need. Looking back on the journey from loan fraud to wedding celebration, I'm struck by how thoroughly Patricia transformed herself. The woman who'd once tried to control our financial future had learned to build her own. Fear had been replaced by curiosity, anxiety by engagement, control by trust. Our family had been broken and rebuilt stronger, with clearer boundaries and more honest communication. Some crises destroy relationships, others create opportunities for people to become who they were always meant to be. Patricia's second chance at love proved that redemption is possible at any age, if you're willing to do the work of changing yourself rather than trying to change everyone else. 3 years have passed since that phone call from the bank, and I'm sitting in Patricia and Harold's kitchen, watching her teach their neighbor's teenage grandson how to balance a checkbook. The boy had gotten his first job and wanted to learn about managing money. Patricia spread his pay stubs across the table, showed him how to track expenses, explained the difference between needs and wants. Money isn't scary when you understand it, she told him. It's just a tool, like a hammer or a calculator. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who'd once tried to secretly borrow $90,000 against our house was now trusted by neighbors to teach their children about financial responsibility. But watching her explain compound interest and emergency funds, I saw genuine expertise rather than anxiety. Patricia had transformed her greatest weakness into her most valuable skill. The fear that had nearly destroyed our family had become her qualification for helping others. Harold emerged from his garden with a basket of tomatoes, dirt under his fingernails and sweat on his forehead. At 72, he was more energetic than men half his age. "Your grandmother knows more about money than most bank managers," he told the teenager, kissing Patricia's cheek. She blushed like a newlywed, though they'd been married 18 months now. Their affection was easy, comfortable, built on genuine friendship rather than desperate need. David and I had been invited for Sunday dinner, a monthly tradition that felt nothing like the tense family meals from Patricia's anxious years. She cooked without stress, served without performing, and cleaned up with Harold's help rather than doing everything herself. When the teenager's mother arrived to pick him up, Patricia handed her a list of budgeting resources and offered to meet again next week. "No charge," she said. "Just pass it forward when you can." After our guests left, we sat on Patricia and Harold's back porch, drinking iced tea and watching the sunset. Harold was planning expansion of his vegetable garden. Patricia was reading applications for her latest scholarship fund. They moved around each other with the easy coordination of people who'd learned to share space without losing themselves. Neither of them needed taking care of, but both enjoyed being cared for. The difference was subtle but crucial. "I got a call from the community college this week," Patricia mentioned casually. "They want me to develop a curriculum for their financial literacy program." This was her third job offer in 6 months. Word had spread about her success with senior education and fraud prevention. "I told them I'd think about it," she continued. "But honestly, I'm enjoying the consulting work more than I expected. Setting my own schedule, choosing my own clients." David smiled at his mother across the small table. "You're becoming a business owner," he said. "Dad would be proud." Patricia's face softened at the mention of Robert, but without the sharp grief that had defined her first years of widowhood. "He always said I was good with numbers," she replied. "I just wish it hadn't taken me 70 years to figure out how to use that skill positively instead of letting it make me crazy with worry." Harold reached for Patricia's hand. "Everything happens when it's supposed to," he said. "You needed to go through that difficult period to understand what other people are feeling when they're scared about money." Patricia squeezed his fingers, and I thought about how different this version of her was from the woman who'd lived in our guest room. That Patricia had been isolated in her fears, this one was connected to a community of people she was actually helping. The conversation turned to David's promotion at work, my latest project, Harold's plans for a greenhouse addition. Normal family topics, discussed without undercurrents of anxiety or obligation. When Patricia asked about our finances, it was polite interest rather than invasive concern. When we mentioned needing a new roof, She offered the name of Harold's reliable contractor without suggesting we couldn't handle the decision ourselves. These small interactions showed how completely our dynamics had shifted. Margaret called during dinner, and Patricia put her on speaker so we could all say hello. "I'm in Florida," Margaret announced, "and I met the most wonderful man at my hotel's bridge tournament." At 73, Margaret was having her own late-in-life romance. "He's a retired teacher from Ohio, widowed 2 years, and he makes me laugh until my sides hurt." Patricia clapped her hands with genuine delight. "When do we meet him?" The sisters' relationship had deepened since Patricia's crisis, built on honesty rather than the careful protection they'd maintained for decades. After dinner, Harold showed us photo albums from their recent trip to Italy, their second international vacation together. Patricia looked radiant in pictures taken at the Trevi Fountain, confident at outdoor cafes, relaxed on Mediterranean beaches. "I never thought I'd be brave enough to travel like this," she told me while Harold and David discussed baseball scores. "But Harold makes me feel adventurous instead of anxious. He sees possibilities where I used to see problems." The photo albums also contained pictures from David's birthday party last month, my graduation from the master's program I'd started during Patricia's crisis year. Our family gatherings looked different now, less posed, more genuine. Everyone appeared comfortable rather than careful. The anxiety that had once characterized our interactions had been replaced by something lighter, easier. We'd learned to enjoy each other instead of managing each other. As the evening wound down, Patricia packed leftovers for us to take home. But instead of the desperate abundance she'd once prepared, trying to prove her worth through food, this was simple generosity. "Harold made too much garlic bread," she said, wrapping it in foil. "And I know David won't cook for himself this week." These gestures felt loving rather than anxious, chosen rather than compulsive. Driving home, David and I reflected on the changes we'd all experienced. "Mom seems genuinely happy," he said. "Not just content or coping, but actually excited about her life." I agreed, thinking about Patricia's animated discussion of her scholarship recipients, her pride in Harold's garden success, her plans for the college curriculum. She was building rather than protecting, creating rather than preventing. The difference had transformed everyone around her. Our own marriage had strengthened through the process of surviving Patricia's betrayal and rebuilding family relationships. We'd learned to discuss problems when they were manageable rather than waiting for crises. Last month, when I felt overwhelmed by work deadlines and graduate school pressures, I told David directly instead of hoping he'd guess. When he worried about his job security during company reorganization, he shared those fears instead of carrying them alone. The communication skills we developed in family therapy had improved every aspect of our relationship. The house we'd almost lost to Patricia's loan application felt truly ours now, free from the weight of her anxiety and our own assumptions about family obligation. We'd redecorated the guest room, turning it into David's home office rather than a space held in reserve for dependent relatives. The physical change represented an emotional shift. We were making choices based on our own needs rather than other people's expectations or emergencies. Patricia's influence on our financial planning had been unexpectedly positive. Her crisis had forced us to examine our own money management, leading to better budgeting and more intentional saving. We'd learned the difference between being prepared for emergencies and being paralyzed by imaginary disasters. Our recent decision to start a college fund for future children felt exciting rather than stressful. We were planning for possibilities rather than protecting against catastrophes. Last week, a young neighbor had asked for advice about caring for her aging mother who was showing signs of financial anxiety. I found myself sharing Patricia's story, explaining how family crises could create opportunities for growth if handled with patience and professional help. The hardest part was learning to support her without enabling her fears, I told the neighbor. But once we figured that out, everything else became possible. Helping someone else navigate similar challenges felt like completing a circle. The scholarship fund Patricia had established with the money from selling her wedding ring had grown beyond anything she'd originally envisioned. Local businesses were contributing, recipients were volunteering as mentors for new applicants, and the program was expanding to help single fathers as well as mothers. Patricia's decision to turn her pain into purpose had created something larger than any of us had anticipated. Her worst mistake had become her greatest legacy. Standing in our driveway that evening, David and I looked back toward the direction of Patricia and Harold's house. "Do you think she'll ever stop surprising us?" David asked. I considered the question seriously. The woman who'd tried to secretly mortgage our home had become a respected financial educator, successful business consultant, and genuinely happy newlywed. I hope not, I replied. People who can change that dramatically at 70 are probably capable of anything. Tonight, as I finish telling this story, I'm struck by how completely my understanding of protection has evolved. Patricia thought protection meant controlling outcomes, eliminating risks, solving problems before they occurred. But real protection, I've learned, means creating space for people to make mistakes, face consequences, and find their own strength. Sometimes love requires stepping back rather than stepping in, trusting rather than controlling, supporting rather than rescuing. The loan application that once felt like such a betrayal now seems like a strange gift. The crisis that forced our family to grow up, develop better communication, and build relationships based on choice rather than obligation. We discovered that trust, once broken and rebuilt intentionally, could become stronger than trust that had never been tested. Patricia's journey from fear to freedom had taught all of us that it's never too late to become who you're meant to be, if you're willing to do the work of changing yourself rather than trying to change everyone else. Our family had been broken and rebuilt, and the new version felt more honest, more resilient, more genuinely loving than what we'd had before. Some disasters destroy everything in their path, others clear away what was never meant to last, making room for something better to grow. Patricia's second chance at love, our stronger marriage, and the trust we'd rebuilt from scratch proved that redemption is always possible, no matter how badly you've messed up, as long as you're willing to face the truth about yourself and do the hard work of real change.